update. Afterwards, you'll hear from the BoPS and PlanX teams with their updates. And finally, if you're watching live, we'd love to take any questions you might have. And at the right side of the screen, you should be able to see a box where you can enter any questions, and we'll respond to these either at the end of each presentation or at the end of the show and tell overall. We've got a lot to get through, so with no further delay, I'll pass you to our planning register team.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Tom. I am a designer who's been working on the Planning Register Discovery Alpha project. And I'm going to kick us off by just giving us a bit of a brief overview of what we've been doing on this project. So we started with this purpose to create a planning register solution that supports the use and adoption of BoPS and PlanX. So as tools that aim to create a new planning system, they have this need to provide public access to the applications that have been made valid and been approved through this process. And we have this vision for the register as a public resource for anyone who wants to find out about planning applications. And it would be underpinned by open data so that we can share this information more widely than is currently possible. And it allows it to be easy to interact with and support the most common journeys, but also help deliver efficiencies and hopefully innovation in the wider planning ecosystem as well. So we're right at the end of our phase of work that we've been on. So we've had 5 sprints that have involved various sort of research, interviews, sketching, designing, testing, and iterating as well. And so we're sort of presenting some of our near final findings and work so far. And there will be a further sort of final report that will be available very shortly too. So what I'm here to talk about today is the prototype. So we've been building a prototype version of a planning register based on all of our interviews with different users. So we've been working with residents and consultees and looking at what a data-led planning register would look like. So afterwards, you'll be able to go and have a look at this prototype. There's a link here to the Figma. So once you get access to the slides later on, you'll be able to go and have a play around and have a look around yourself. But I'm now going to take you through. We did this prototype and we've recently tested it with 3 residents and with 3 consultees. So you'll see the resident quotes in the pink and the consultee quotes in the blue as we go through. So this was our application page. This was the landing page when they came into the planning register. And we were exploring some different options here, searches that were most immediate. So using location to find things near me. We discovered from residents that finding things that were relevant to them was the most important thing. So we were looking at ways to allow them a quick route in. Consultees were much more driven by reference numbers or pieces of data that were a little bit more, were going to be much more useful for text search. And we also explored some other innovations we've seen across other products, such as like search by sentence. Overall, we found that actually the sort of text-based search that was familiar was probably most likely to be useful, and some of the more innovative things were not necessarily going to be picked up by the users. We were having a look at map search as well, so looking at ways to present this information on a map. This is a relatively common feature of existing registers, and we were looking at potentially combining this with GIS data as well, so overlaying, for example, conservation areas on top of this planning application, or these planning applications that might be there. So there was a couple of concerns around the level of complexity that might be there, but it was useful for both residents and consultees to be able to see this kind of richer information that we do now through Digital Land have available and can sort of integrate into one place, so that you can understand maybe the interactions between what applications are in what areas and maybe the constraints that apply to them. We also looked at text-based searching, and so what users picked out of this was the importance for visual and summary information to be really important. So here we've used, rather than using like full descriptions, we've used much more short summary terms, which we can imagine being taken from Plan X application data in their list of works. And these were seen as really useful for people to be able to immediately get an idea of what is going on in any application. However, there were some challenges around how we structure this information, and also what kind of filters we use, what ones would be useful both for different consultees who might have different framings, but also residents who might have different interests. So whether that's around number of homes or, for example, retrofit projects. We're moving on to the application page, and we've split this down into different parts because there's different amounts of information here, but we're looking at the top of this page. People felt it was quite easy to jump in, it was quite easy to find the summary, and seeing a sort of map and was the most important thing, particularly for consultees. That's their way in some of these sort of key visual pieces of information. Below that was an application progress bar, and this got a lot of great feedback, particularly from residents. They liked being able to see, for example, both the progress of the application through approval, as well as post approval. So seeing things like condition discharges or seeing amendments that might happen. And some residents were really pushing for this timeline to be sort of their way into the application, so they could interact with it and maybe find the particular bits of information that would be of interest to them through this. So it was a really quite successful way of making that date and sort of event information usable. We explored different ways of presenting documents, so it was both residents and consultees were very keen to see plans separated out from sort of reports, comments and other documents that might be there. But there was a question around application forms and design and access forms, where they might fall across this and the role they might play, particularly as we look away from sort of an application form as a document and towards that being stored as a set of data about the application as well. So we've taken that on board, and there's some further iterations that have been planned for them. Below this, we were looking at ways that we might structure some of the documents or the reports that were held, or maybe some of the assessments. So looking at thematic ways of structuring information. And people, this was seen as quite useful. Consultees loved the idea that they'd be able to jump into an area and just find all their relevant documents. Residents also thought it was quite interesting because this maybe supported them in their particular interests, looking at an application to find things they're interested in. But there was some idea that some of these terms, design and access, might need a little bit of explanation, so that, or things like amenity particularly might need explanation, so they could understand what it might be that they would be able to discover looking into one of these areas. And looking at the decision section and further actions. So one of the things we had identified in our early research was that conditions are very hard to understand, very hard to go and view from a decision. It might be listed on the decision notice, but it's quite hidden away in a document. And then there's no connection to go and see what actually happened. Was that discharged? Has that been discharged? Was there anything else? Has that been triggered by, you know, some need? So we were looking at ways to connect this up, putting the decision together with what we call these further actions, encompassing maybe conditions and maybe Section 106 obligations as well. We found we'd chosen to use the term further actions because we felt it might be more understandable to residents. However, we were very wrong in this thing, and actually we sort of uncovered that it's actually going to be much more useful to use the technical terminology but explain it in context. So explain to people that, you know, it is a decision based upon these conditions. And going for that, I think, is going to help the understandability and discoverability of these things. We also looked a bit further at how we might display this conditions information at slightly more detail. So how could you go and see the details of these, and splitting them up maybe by those which are sort of apply all the time, those which might need to be met at a certain point, and those which might be triggered by certain events. And this was both for consultees and residents found to be quite useful. It was good to see them in groups. Consultees were quite keen to group them also by the theme. So if they were highways related conditions, that would help them with their monitoring and discovery of different things going forwards. We looked at light assessments, and one thing here was we've used the name of the planning officer here who's making the comment, and this was quickly picked up by residents sort of not really understanding this, although it might help. We sort of initially thought it might help create some sort of rapport between the two. Actually, it kind of hid who this was and why it was worth listening to what they had to say about the light in this case. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Holly, who's going to take us through some extension ideas we had beyond this kind of core press type.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. Yes, so we also, in these research sessions with residents and consultees, wanted to explore some slightly wider ideas that might explore the sort of outer reaches of the vision. So these are definitely things for the future. So these, I'll just start with the ideas we had for the consultees. So this first one came out of the first round of research we had, where people talked about wanting to see documentation from other applications nearby that they were currently commenting on. So we put together a sort of like an example of how that might look. I think the most common comment we got was something like, I'd rather see the applications themselves compared to the documents, so I could actually see all the information, not just the document on its own. But other than that, people found that idea, the consultees perspective found the idea really interesting, and would definitely be interested in seeing sort of like applications that have been in the local area to what they're currently working on. The next idea we put in front of consultees was also something that came out of the first research session. And we talked about this in the last show and tell, was that consultees really wanted the register to help them with their workflow. So we kind of like took that to a slightly further extension, and what would it look like if they could see planning applications assigned to me. So I think like we had some interesting discussions around it, and we understood a bit more about how they work. I don't think this is something that necessarily feels within the scope of planning register currently. I think like as we sort of explored it further, the consultees started to feel like it was getting quite big, but still an interesting conversation to have anyway. And we had comments like, I don't have a list, there's so many, we just work through the pile from the bottom. Another idea we put in front of consultees came out of one of our sketching sessions. So this was the idea of in the pre-application phase, being able for the consultees to be able to actually make recommendations directly to an applicant about maybe if you add a bit of this or remove a bit of that, the application is more likely to succeed. It didn't test well at all. So the idea of sort of like sending information didn't, I think like the people we spoke to, I think a comment we got, which was really interesting, was I prefer to see the whites of applicants' eyes. We really have to try and make them listen. And the context of that was that he'd tried sending emails and just they hadn't sort of acknowledged the information that had been sent in it and carried on anyway. So don't feel like this is something we'll necessarily be continuing with. However, this one consultees were really interested in. So this is an idea around showing all the different responses from different consultees, so that as they're making their comments, they can see what other teams and consultees have said. And so they said things like, this is really helpful, and I'd also want to see which officer had written the response, so that if they need to get in touch to ask them questions, they'd know who the point of contact was. And then some ideas for the future for residents. So in the last show and tell, we talked about how it was really important that for residents that they could see the information that was relevant to them and making it personal to them. So a way that we explored that was like if there was a big development, could a resident go in and see how, for example, that might impact light for them. So we mocked it up quite simply, and I think people were really interested in the idea. And I think one interesting comment I thought as they sort of went through this was that, okay, so what's written here is sort of like a decision that's been made internally, but I want to see an option to challenge this or to have it explained to me or to be able to give my opinion, because I might think that actually it has a much bigger impact on me. And so I thought that was quite interesting in sort of opening up conversations. Another idea, so this is very small, but you'll see sort of towards the bottom of this screen, there's a big text box and it says above it, sign up to receive updates about this application and be alerted when building work starts. So this came out of the research we've done in the previous round as well, about residents wanting to understand how it impacts them, when will the noise start and things like that. All the residents we spoke to were really interested in this. They said things like, this is great. I don't want to have to look back to keep track. I want updates for changes, and also maybe when there has been no action for a long time as well. So that was definitely something they were interested in. This idea also came out of the idea of how we might explain to them the impact of trying to explain where within a large site the development might be taking, so you could understand how far away the noise or the works might be. I think they perhaps struggle to understand the concepts. It's like comments were like, it's okay, but buildings are blobs. I need to see height or other sort of dimensions as well to really understand the impact on me. And then finally, for residents, an idea that has sort of like come through the research and sketching sessions was an idea about showing how a planning application or decision has been negotiated. So hopefully showing how the planning officer has negotiated a better decision and what the communication's been between the planning officer and the applicant. Residents were really interested in this. And said things like, I usually really like to see the correspondent. Having the reasons on a timeline is excellent. So I think seeing why decisions have been made is really interesting to people. So those were sort of slightly wider ideas that we explored as well. Just as a quick wrap up, we'll go into these in a bit more depth in the final deck next week. But things that people, I think, responded well to were visual elements like maps, timeline, and colour coding. I think it just helps explain the process in a more simple and easy to understand way. For Consultees, a better way to organise documents was definitely interesting for them. Everyone loved the maps. I think it helps ground all of that information into reality a little bit, makes it clear where it's happening. And filtering searches was something that was really interesting to both residents and Consultees. And I think there's probably a bit of work to do into really pinning down what those filters would be, but definitely something we could explore. And we've also tried to start summarising our findings into some design principles for the register. So we think a huge purpose of this is to provide clarity to the process by being visual first. So coming back to those timelines, maps, colour coding, etc. So everyone who comes to this is always, everyone we've spoken to has come to the register with a very specific intent or a particular purpose. And I think that's a mindset that as a team we need to have when going forward is how will each individual who comes here be able to find the information they want quickly. And that's what we mean by segment of one. It's like, how can we make this work for each individual person's need? Open collaboration is something that sort of came up as a theme across both Consultees and residents. So being able to show what other people have said and how the process works. So sort of inspiring a bit more collaboration and a bit more communication and conversation definitely seemed to be a theme that was of interest to everyone involved. And the final one is actually what Tom has touched on earlier, which is that residents didn't understand conditions and terminology like that. So we tried simplifying and that didn't work either. So I think we've come to the conclusion that we need to use the correct terminology, but explain it well instead. So that's everything from the design side. I think I'm handing over to Ed now to talk a bit more about data.
Thank you, Holly and Tom. Yeah, so as part of this register work, we looked at our current data and what data we need to drive that register. So at the moment, we've got two sources of data. So we have the planning application API, which is our connection into legacy systems, allowing us to pull data from existing systems within councils. And we have BoPS as well. So we looked at data from both of those sources and began to identify what is available through the API from legacy or BoPS. And then once we'd identified everything that we needed, we then began to look at breaking that down into our requirements for our minimum viable product. Next slide, please. So what we found is we have a reasonable amount of data for our minimum viable product via our API. that will be included in that, which is kind of the very core basic data that's required to drive that. So if I have the next slide, and then we have an amount of data which we have available through BoPS, but not currently through that link to existing systems. So this is beginning to go into slightly richer data, stuff that's going to drive some of that additional functionality that we saw in the previous slides with Holly and Tom. Majority of that data is available to us, but not yet through that API. So that will be kind of our next focus as we move forward developing the product. And then if I can have the next slide. We then have data that isn't available through that API or in BoPS. So this is where we begin to get into where we were getting a lot of really good feedback was around that timeline and having those connections built between conditions and the applications being received to discharge them. So it's building that relationship thing. And at this point in time, it doesn't exist in either system for us to pull on. So this is kind of our next focus after we've got that minimum viable to actually begin to pull in that really rich data and cohesive system where you can click onto conditions and it will show you the applications that have come in to discharge them, and vice versa as well. If you've got a discharge for a condition, you can trace it back to its parent application. I think that's it for me. So if I have the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Kevin, who's going to talk through some of the technical elements.
Thanks, Ed. I'm Kevin, developer at Unbots. So we started to look at the technical architecture for making historical and new planning application data open and available. We started the project looking at schemas and formats of storing this data. And it became clear there's multiple sources, and there's one that we can work with that a lot of councils use, which is a Power BI export from Uniform. So we based the schema on that import and the data available to us in BoPS. We kept the software flexible enough to handle different types of formats. And then it became clear that the schema was less important than the means of ingesting the data. Next slide, please. So we developed a tool that allows data to be imported from Uniform via Power BI. It can handle very large uploads, process works in jobs, and returns false and stops processing when the data is incorrect. And this sits on the underlying API, which we spoke about. So this API and tool has the potential to receive data directly from Power BI, but we couldn't test this as part of the tool. So just going to share my screen and hopefully that'll work. Can you all see my screen? Yeah. Okay, so this is a really quick run through of the tool. It handles large, so hundreds of thousands of rows of CSV files, which are exports from Power BI, but I'll just do 20 of them for now. So let's go through that. So what happens now is a job starts running in the background, and you should be able to see progress updates if this goes well. Okay, so I see. The data is already in the database, so that explains why. But this shows kind of how it manages these things in the background. It's a very quick demo. That's a finished sharing screen.
It's still sharing at the moment.
So how do I stop that? Sorry.
Share over the top.
Yeah, I'm not doing it.
And go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that's a really quick run through of the tool we have there. Next slide, please. We also started looking at our data strategy of how these organisations and systems can share data with each other. So first of all, we examined a centralised data store. Benefits of this is it would give one point of truth, and external data would find its way eventually to the central database. Looking at the pros and cons, it's quite politically difficult to implement this kind of large system. There'd be issues around who would fund it, and data wouldn't be in real time. This is a problem across distributed databases called eventual consistency. You wouldn't know if the data is up to date and you couldn't rely on it. Next slide, please. We also looked at individual system data storage. This is where each system stores its own data in a format unique to its system, so whatever it needs, and the data transfer is agreed around these data formats. The main problem with this sort of system is it's expensive for dependent systems to change and migrate. Next slide, please. So we eventually concluded on a proposal for a hybrid strategy, which is an open API standard for planning application information data exchange. So suppliers and organizations send data and pull data from endpoints. Data could then be updated in batches overnight. Service level agreements would be agreed, availability, rate limits, and redaction, that sort of thing. And this would encourage organisations to adopt this sort of standard before any legislation comes in place. Next slide, please. So we're going to update this website, our documentation website, hopefully later today with some of these proposals. That's it.
Thanks very much. We've had a couple of questions come through. I will just quickly run through those now before moving on to Repro and Planex and BoPS teams. First question is from Anthony Evans. Were there any comments, thoughts on where and how a user could provide feedback on where conditions weren't being met that might lead to enforcement actions? I think, Tom, that was probably directed at you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's come up. We haven't had the chance to sort of look at that as such, but including sort of links to enforcement reporting as part of the register with those sort of linked conditions is a recommendation we will be making for future work.
Thank you. And the other question was from Lee Goodall, said, would be interested to know, have more information on how you get the timeline live on the website webpage.
So I think that's it's a question around how we're passing live event data to the register. So I think rather than uploading to the register we'd update that record for an application when new applications came in. So each time a condition was discharged or some other event came in, and part of this is looking at what data sets we'd integrate with. So there's some planning applications, those would cover our conditions, the discharge of those, for example. Section 106 things we know are a bit more complicated. They're usually stored in another system, so we'd have to look at how those events might be passed into the register so they could be kept track of. And it's likely that would maybe be a longer term thing beyond conditions. So we would look at each time data is passed into the system, if there's a connection, we're able to pull that through and show that there's now an application received for discharge, or it has been discharged, or whatever. So that's sort of roughly how it works, but there is some levels of complexity that undersit that around what we would need to integrate with to enable that to work.
Thank you. And just one final question that snuck in a bit late. David Chamberlain's referring to the architectural strategy. He's asked, are you considering how that would work for iDocs hosted customers?
That's how we try and encourage that data to be opened up through pushing a kind of open API standard for opening up this data. So we'd want to make it as easy as possible for suppliers to sort of conform with this standard, and make it flexible enough that they would minimise the work they'd have to do.
All right, thanks, guys. We'll now pass over to the BoPS team for their updates.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, next, I'm going to talk to you about consultations. This is some background and context about why we prioritized consultations for the BoPS product. And just quickly before I start, I'm Yasmin. I'm a service designer working with the BoPS team from Unboxed. So consultations for planning applications are one of the key and missing features in BoPS. We've prioritized the discovery as part of the BoPS roadmap because when we introduced more application types, such as prior approvals and householder applications, we will need the consultations process to be available in BoPS. BoPS must support consultations for it to be adoptable as planning software for councils to use. This discovery will help us identify opportunities to improve the current process and explore ideas for a BoPS solution. So what we've done so far, we've aligned on our research approach and outputs with the project team, including the product owners. We've carried out semi-structured interviews with 7 users, including validation officers and case officers. This was across 4 councils. And then we had current state user journey mapping sessions to help us identify user pain points and challenges. 6 users were involved from across 3 councils. We've then synthesized our research and reframed some of the insights into opportunities that we can explore further. So what we're doing next is we have planned co-creation workshops to prioritize these opportunities and explore the ideas further with partner councils. So we have one in-person workshop with 2 councils this week, and next week we have one remote workshop with 2 councils, because we wanted to make sure that councils who are not able to attend in person are also included and have a say in what ideas we explore and eventually create. Next slide, please. The problem statement, as we understand it, is that the consultation process can be confusing and time-consuming. The type of application and the planning constraints affect the types of consultations required. However, making a decision about who to consult is not always straightforward, which causes delays in the application process. In addition, reviewing, redacting information, and following up on responses is a lengthy process, which contributes to delays in processing applications. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges, and this is by no means a comprehensive list of all the challenges that we've uncovered, but we just wanted to share with you some examples of the challenges and opportunities we will be exploring in these workshops. One of the challenges is around extracting useful factual information and weeding out irrelevant, often emotive neighbor responses is very time consuming. So we thought, how might we reduce the time it takes for case officers to review responses, and how might we reduce the time it takes to redact documents? These are just a way for us to frame the challenges and help us. They're very generic, so it'll allow us to explore ideas freely. The second challenge is chasing both internal and external consultees is frustrating to the planning officer and causes delays in making decisions about applications. How might we reduce the time an officer spends on chasing consultees? And how might we help officers contact the right consultees in order to get responses faster? I have to say that this was one of the biggest pain points we heard from councils, chasing. So it'll be an interesting challenge to explore for sure. The third one is around consultation responses are received through different channels and formats, which makes monitoring, collating, and organizing them inefficient. how might we streamline the process of collecting, receiving, and keeping track of responses? I will hand over. This is it for the consultations. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will hand over to Duncan Miller from Newcastle to talk to us about the BoPS team Newcastle visit.
Hi, Yasmin. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Just a couple of slides just to tell you about a recent visit that Unbox did when they came to see us in person in Newcastle. So there you can see Freya and Yasmin and Rosanna. And what we did was we basically, in terms of the schedule, there was an in-person walkthrough of the BoPS processing of an LDC. And then we had a Q&A from Newcastle planners, which I think was really interesting. We had a couple of team managers there in person, and I think there was some really good questions asked. Rosanna took us through a BoPS product roadmap, and again, there was a fair few questions around that. We then in the afternoon spent quite a lot of time doing a click-by-click, and it really was a click-by-click process journey of a householder application in iDocs Cloud, or Tascomi as it's sometimes known. And for that, in Newcastle, we've got different roles involved in that process. So we have business support. We have it fairly truncated, where we have business support colleagues do the validation and the check-in, and then it's sort of handed over to planning officers. So I think we got into some really quite deep dive around what the process was, which I think was really interesting. Next slide. Some of the takeaways were, I think certainly my colleagues were excited about BoPS and its potential. They were really impressed with its user friendliness and its smoothness, and having Freya there, who's from a local planning authority, was really, I think, helpful to answer some of the planning questions. I think one of the other takeaway was, how do we achieve a solution to resolve dual processing, which is key for us. Seeing iDocs Cloud Tascomi in operation and appreciating the differences between it, Uniform, and BoPS. And I know a couple of people have already mentioned that in the chat today around iDocs Cloud and Uniform, and you know, how that worked was really insightful. I think what we were interested in, and we were curious after the meeting, was to find out more about precisely what information flows between the systems and the detailed sort of mechanics behind it. So that was it in terms of, it was a really useful day, and thanks for you guys for spending time and coming up to see us. I can hand back.
Great. Thanks, Duncan. And the BoPS team will now there's no questions to come through, so we'll just go straight through to the PlanX team. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Hi everyone, I'm Alistair from Open Systems Lab. So we're going to talk about three quick little things today. If we go to the next slide, please. The main one of the main kind of focus areas really for this phase is working on a whole range of features that really significantly improve the experience for applicants using PlanX. But I'm not going to talk about that. So that's a sort of teasing trailer. For next show and tell, we're going to go through and talk about lots of the work that we're doing on that. Weirdly, the first thing, next slide, please, that we're going to talk about today is actually weirdly at the other end of the spectrum. So one of the main themes, next slide, please, is obviously, you know, one of our main kind of principles or agendas of moving towards a digital planning system is this shift from moving from documents to data, right? And generally that's a good thing, but of course sometimes it creates issues. So on the next slide, we can say, well, this is all very well if we've got a situation where the user is applying using a Plan X, and then that application is being sent over to, say, BoPS and the existing register, and it's BoPS is expecting a whole range of data. But if the application is going to be processed in one of the existing back office systems and registers, those systems are expecting a bit of data, but less data, and they're also expecting some documents like location plans and forms and things like this. And the result of this was that officers, next slide please, were having to do a whole bunch of manual workarounds and sort of tearing their hair out, and generally that's no fun, to essentially kind of replicate these documents to get that data back into documents, which seems like a strange thing to do, but it's part of this kind of process of having these systems kind of all work alongside each other. So the solution that we've been working on is a number of features. On the next slide, please, is a slightly sideways solution to this, but probably one you'd expect, which is to automatically generate some of these documents from the data that we have. There's a few of these. So one, basically with every application that gets sent from Plan X through to a back office system like Uniform, or even if it's just being sent into an email inbox, you'll get a payload, not just along with it, not just of the CSV data and not just of the documents that the applicant has provided, but also some of these additional documents that have been automatically created. So a folder that might look something like this. And so if we have an investigation, one of these you'll see is called location plan. Next slide, please. I'm not going to get all these out and show them now, but you can get the idea of what's going on here. Basically, location plan is an HTML. When you hit it, it'll open up in your browser and you can click file print, and it will print to you the location plan with a scale bar and a north pointer, etc. So that fits that. Next one, please. There is also a page called, which is called Overview, and it's the same basic thing, which is a big document which contains all of some key data about that application and all of the answers that the applicant has provided. We provided a version of this with officers, and quite reasonably their feedback was, oh, this is a bit ugly and difficult to read. So Jess has done some really nice work to make this kind of just more visual really, and just much nicer and easier to look at and to read. And it includes things like the pre-assessment flag result that Plan X has generated, saying it looks like this is permitted development or whatever. So hopefully that will be quite useful. And then it also produces, on the next slide, please, some forms in the form of docs. And here I have to give lots of credit to work that Greg Lambeth has done, and also Ben, one of our developers, has done to effectively take a whole load of data and compile it into the standard form document that that back office systems would be expecting and that you might need. The nice thing is also at the moment we're generating these as docx's, so even if it's not absolutely perfect, and there's still a couple of workarounds, all this stuff that does work is done for you. So it's a kind of hopefully making things significantly better. So that's a kind of strange sort of invisible layer behind the work. And next slide, please, but kind of worthwhile. But we're also, what's come really clear in that at the moment, those form generators, those automatic form generators, if you like, are hard coded. And of course, as we're doing that, we realize that that works okay for now for the LDC services, but it won't scale as we're looking ahead to doing multiple services. For example, we're currently working on prior approval, and every single type of prior approval has its own form. So one of the things that we'll still have to do at some point fairly soon on the roadmap is actually building a little widget that makes it much easier to customize and create those on a service by service basis to spit out exactly these kind of outputs. But hopefully it'll go some way to really helping bridge that gap in situations where people are using a data powered front end service like Plan X facing the applicants, but then are using a range of different back office systems that are sometimes expecting documents. The next one, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jess to talk about a piece of work that she's been doing.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Jess, a developer at OSL, and I'm going to talk about how we are currently introducing automatically picking up classified roads as you're working through a PlanX service. Next slide, please. So the first is sort of, why do we care about classified roads in PlanX services? Currently, there are a number of projects that an applicant may be interested in taking on that would show up in lawful development certificates or find out if you need planning permission. Specifically, things like dropped curbs are examples here. And that means that if an applicant is on this project path, they would see perhaps this question that basically just has to give them a link right now to open another tab, do some external research. And what we're really interested in PlanX is, I like to kind of think of it of like, how do you get through a planning application with as few tabs open as possible and sort of all of your research happening in one place in the app. Exactly. So next slide, please. So what users will see. And this is really similar to exactly what happens now. So you draw your site boundary based on the address and postcode that you searched in the beginning. And then we're going to show you a list of planning constraints and things that might affect your project. Going forward, you're going to see an extra item in this list, which is whether or not you're on a classified road. So hopefully really simple from the applicant perspective, but a bit of like what we have to do behind the scenes to make this happen, because roads are treated and published differently than other types of constraints we can check. So next slide, please. So a little bit of what is happening technically here. The applicant draws a red line boundary around their site. And then if we follow this top path, most policy data sets, and these are all things that we pull from digital land and anyone in the public can also access at planning.data.gov.uk with the Planning Data API, are published as polygons. So we are able to sort of use the user's drawn site boundary exactly as is to check for intersections. And this makes sure that we don't pick up if you're trying to work on a building that is next door to a listed building. We obviously want to make sure that we're not picking up neighboring properties in these cases, right? And it's exactly limited to your drawing. But with roads, we have like an interesting sort of like tricky scenario, which is that roads are published as lines. So what the applicant draws, unfortunately, like unless they have drawn sort of badly, is probably not a red line that has extended into the road. So in order to find intersecting roads, we need to apply a buffer and then do a search. And sort of the other thing that happens here too is when we apply this buffer and do this search, we're going to pick up all roads that you intersect with. And then we do sort of an additional step of filter out any road that isn't a classified road. So if you're on a corner lot, it's common that we're going to pick up more than one road. If you're perhaps on a lot where you have a road to the back and a road to the front, again, we're going to pick up more than one. But then in your results, all you're going to see are sort of what are considered classified roads. And we're going to present those to users in just a nice unified list. And classified road data, we are able to query from the Ordnance Survey master map. So this is a bit different than planning data, the planning data site or digital land, but it is available via Ordnance Survey, which is the same data source around sort of our address search in the beginning of the service. Next slide, please. So some of our next steps that we're doing internally before you'll see this sort of live on services. We're doing a lot of testing and verifying of tricky details, thanks to the help of lots of planning officers across different councils right now, where we're sort of doing the research of what's the best buffer distance, considering that a big goal of PlanX is to kind of aim to have a standard for these things, and then sort of like test and validate that over time and see what works. We know we're doing this first step of filtering based on classified or not classified, but within classified roads, you also have things like A type, B type, C type, I think there's going to be some questions going forward of, do we need to care about those differences? Should we automatically detect that too? The difference of front versus back classified roads based on the property. So yeah, thinking through some of these questions. Another piece is developing content and updating services. And this is so that even though we will now be automatically querying this data for applicants when we can, we want to make sure that they still always have relevant follow-up questions to ensure that if for some reason we have queried sort of like a bad piece of data or an outdated piece of data, that the applicant can still give the right answer. And so we always sort of try and have this balance of relevant follow-up questions and sort of automatic searches that save you that extra tab or extra site that you need to navigate yourself. And then in the future, we're also, I think, excited to introduce sort of a restyled planning constraints list. We know right now it's a very dense and long list of information, and it's hard to understand what these actually mean. There's lots of planning jargon in there. So yeah, as that list grows, definitely we're aware that it's pretty dense and are looking forward to like thinking through ways to break it up.
Fantastic, thanks Jess. And yeah, hopefully there'll be some cool design stuff around that included in the next show and tell actually. So finally, this is a kind of looking ahead thing actually, and it's very relevant to the things that we've already had in this show and tell, to do with the register and BoPS. So obviously one of the things that's happening in the next phase is there's going to be more councils joining, but also more councils bring more systems, and there's obviously an appetite for councils to be able to get data out of Plan X into a whole variety of potential systems. But also, of course, as you can imagine, here lies potential for a huge amount of mayhem and confusion and generally getting bogged down. So we've been spending some time looking ahead and really sweating through what should our approach to be towards really kind of standardizing and scaling up our approach to integrations and how people are going to get data out of Plan X in future. So next slide, please. So very high level, Plan X has not, you think of Plan X as having two interfaces, right? Which is the interface that the public see, which is where they use planning services, like applying for something or finding out if they need planning permission or whatever it might be. Or back one, please. The second one, the other interface is the editor interface, which is where planning officers and flow editors write and maintain these services as flow charts. But there's also, of course, this third interface, which is the API, which is where people can get that application data that's been submitted out and into their back office systems and so forth. And we've got, you know, some kind of basic working integrations going at the moment, sort of handing off data to BoPS and to Uniform. But obviously, we're looking towards the future of what developing that API for the future in a much more general way. So next slide, please. As everyone going into a tricky problem, it's not always just about the technology, it's about the organizations and how we all organize and collectively work and collaborate. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what actually the fundamental core principles for how we navigate this. I won't go through all of these, but there's some really important decisions in here, including, for example, we realized that obviously it was going to be an absolute nightmare if we kind of allow every single, you know, every single bespoke data schemas for every single council and every single supplier and every single service is going to be an absolute nightmare. So we said, right, let's focus on using shared open standard formats, and so trying to agree on common of those, and if people want to make bespoke ones, then they'll be able to. Next slide, please. So I don't have much time to kind of do this justice, I don't think, but at a very high level, the principle is this, which is that Plan X, of course, collects loads and loads of data with lots of fantastic metadata and detail in there. And of course, not every back office system will be able to or want to use all of this data. So our approach is going to be to take into what we call the Plan X out box, to put that data into that outbox that's available on the API. And there's going to be a range of different things available in that, what we call the payload, on the payload. And people can pick and choose from that menu which bits of data that they want. So the absolute kind of best level, we've got the kind of service schema, which contains not just the data that the user has provided, like their name and stuff like that, but the entire graph structure and how all those questions are interconnected with each other, etc. There's also what we call the submission schema, which is but just the exact journey that a particular user took through that. But then there's also consolidated lists of data, such as the one app standard and such as a new standard, which would be the one effectively that the back office system and digital register are agreeing potentially going forward. And that hopefully is something that's going to evolve, and we need to be able to be built for that future, for the fact that these schemas probably will evolve and grow as the planning system becomes more data driven and less documents driven. And also it will include, as we've already mentioned, the files that the users uploaded and those documents which I mentioned earlier, which have been automatically generated. So say, right, well, actually, if our back office system doesn't have the ability to deal with a location boundary, we won't get that. We'll just come and get the PDF, the HTML location plan. That will all be basically available to pull from. And so we'll have an API, a new API endpoint from which we'll essentially be able to integrate with, and it will notify those services to say, hey, an application's been submitted, come and get it in the structure that you want. And also going that kind of clear principle of clear fences to say, well, actually, it'll then be each supplier will be responsible for then fetching that and making sure that it's been successfully fetched. So we don't get into a game where we're all trying to fix stuff on each other's systems, which will just create endless meetings and endless confusion. Next slide, please. Don't need to talk about this one, so we'll next slide again. What's next? So obviously we're sharing this with suppliers and councils. We don't need to have, hopefully what will mean is we won't need to have individual conversations with every single council. Hopefully the ODP will kind of convene that as a group, but we'll begin to set up those direct connections with those suppliers who are interested in integrating, getting data out of Plan X. That includes, of course, having conversations aligning with the BoPS and register teams, particularly around that data standard and all that stuff. And you know, hopefully you could see sort of between the gaps of this morning how we're sort of moving together towards converging towards a future there. Hopefully, and then of course ultimately we'll be setting about building this new API and endpoint and documentation stuff, which will probably isn't happening right now. We're building other stuff at the moment, so this is a real look ahead, but that will probably be happening around April and May onwards. And with that, I will say thank you and be quiet.
Thank you, Alistair, and to the rest of the Plan X team, and also to Christopher Hertz for your feedback about the road classifications. There's no questions, so that's it from us today. And a huge welcome again to our partner councils, and to everyone else. Thank you for joining us today. Next show and tell is in 4 weeks, 29th of March at 10 AM. I hope to see you there. And just on this page, we've got our project email web address if you want additional information, and the contact emails of the 3 original councils. Thank you, everybody, and see you in 4 weeks.